Well, welcome. This would be the first video for Psych 425, the cognitive psychology. Now, we call this Unit 0 because there's no specific chapter that is allotted. This is basically a little bit of most of the things that we'll cover in this class. So, before we talk about some important concepts, I'm going to give you the context of this class. We're going to discuss the most important cognitive constructs, which is basically about this class, is about cognitive constructs, but in the context of a puzzle. Now, you would be referred to as cognitive Sherlocks, and you would be solving the puzzle. And the puzzle we are here together to solve would be this. How do we comprehend a written text? How do we comprehend a written text? Now, if you think about it, we are specifically talking about comprehension. We didn't say how do we blah 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 written text. We are really interested in comprehension. In understanding comprehension in the context of written text, we're trying to understand the basic mental processes that this class covers. So the question then would be, why comprehension? Well, comprehension is the basic thing your mind does. Now, take any context. For example, you're reading a problem and trying to solve the problem. Let's say 225 times 335. Do you know the answer? Well, I don't care. I'm pretty sure you can figure it out. But the point is that for you to use the principles of multiplication, you need to first understand the printed letters, numbers. So comprehension is basic. Or let's say you're solving, you're reasoning it. Say if it rains, Shri takes an umbrella. Shri took an umbrella. Now you need to comprehend the individual premises in order to come to the conclusion. So the point here is that because comprehension is the basic thing our mind does. And if we understand how mind comprehends things, we can understand how our mind works, which is the basic idea of this class is to understand how our mind works. But we are specifically interested in one aspect of it because that's the most basic thing it does. Why written text? Well, reading is the most important aspect of a college student and understanding comprehension and specifically reading comprehension, I believe would help students be metacognitively aware of their own reading processes, which will definitely influence how they read and how they learn when they read. So that would be the big picture. Now, before we talk about the individual pieces, the idea is that throughout the semester we'll be talking about the individual pieces, and at the end, we'll be putting together these pieces to solve the puzzle as cognitive Sherlocks, and the puzzle is to answer this question. So you, cognitive Sherlocks, will work together with me on these puzzle pieces, and towards the end, in the form of a paper, you actually put together these pieces to actually solve the problem. Okay, but before we get into the pieces, I just wanted to talk about some basic things that you need to know about cognitive psychology slash what cognitive psychologists basically do. So, coming to the basics of cognitive psychology, what cognitive psychologists study is cognition and memory. And in this video, we're gonna talk about what cognition is and what memory is. By the end of this video, you would be able to define cognition, define memory, understand different aspects of it. Then we'll come back to this particular handout where we'll talk about where these things fit and how eventually it will help you solve the puzzle. So let's move on to the cognition first, then we'll talk about memory. So, what is cognition? Well, think of cognition as a mental process. In fact, it's not just one mental process, it is a set of mental processes. And these are a set of not any simple mental processes, these are a set of complex mental processes. You can think of a set as a group, a list of complex mental processes. And we're going to use the term mental processes and as synonymous to another term called cognitive processes. They both refer to the same thing. Well, what is a mental process then, or a cognitive process? Well, mental processes or cognitive processes are those processes or activities or events that happen in our mind that we can't observe, but we can only infer about them. That's why I define mental processes more activities or events that are unobservable, hence inferred. So mental processes are inferred mental activities in one's mind. And a set of such complex mental processes would make up cognition. So, what is cognition? It's a set of complex mental processes. What is a mental process? Well, mental process is an activity, an unobservable mental activity, and we can only infer about it. And we'll talk about the methodologies we use to infer about mental processes. Okay, so we have defined cognition as a set of complex mental processes. An example or examples of such simple mental processes include sensation is one such mental process, attention is another mental process, and perception is another mental process, and so is memory. And I usually use the acronym SAPM because this gives the actual direction in which the mental processes occur in a cognitive system. So, sensation, attention, perception, and memory. SAPM, sensation, attention, perception, and memory. So, cognition is a set of complex mental processes such as sensation, attention, perception, and memory. So, let's talk about each of these mental processes, but let's get to memory first. So, we've defined cognition as a set of mental processes sensation, perception, sensation, attention, perception, and memory. Let's talk about, we said that cognitive psychology study cognition and memory. So, what is memory then? Well, you can think of memory. I use this analogy of wallet. And just imagine if I give you $100, what would you do? Well, just imagine you have a wallet and you put $100 in your wallet and put it in your pocket, and maybe you go to a store and maybe you buy a computer with that $100. So good luck. I don't know if you can get $100 computer. But the idea here is that whatever you did with that $100 is memory as a mental process. And the place where you stored that $100 is also memory, the wallet, which is a storage system. So memory has two aspects to it. Memory refers to a physical system, a physical storage system, a physical storage system like your wallet. But memory also refers to all the things you did with the money. What did you do? Well, you put the information in the wallet. That's called encoding. And you held that $100 in your wallet for a while. That is retaining or storing. And when you went to the computer store, you actually took that $100 out. That is retrieving. So memory as a process, a mental process refers to process of encoding, storing, and retrieving information. As a physical storage system, it is a system that facilitates encoding, storing, and retrieving information. So there are two aspects to it. Memory is both a storage system and a mental process. Now, just to kind of make sure you understand, this is just an analogy, right? One big difference, if you think about it, is that once you retrieve that $100 from your wallet, it's gone if you use it, right? But with your, especially long-term memory, is the more you retrieve information, right? The more retrievable it becomes, the more accessible it becomes. So unlike the currency, the more you use it, the more it is available. So we talked about memory as a process and a system, right? As a process, it is encoding, retaining, and retrieving information. Now, as a system, it is a place where the information is held. Now, you can think of this storage system at different levels, right? There are memory systems at the level of sense organs, and there are memory systems at the level of your brain. For instance, sensory memory is a memory system at the level of your sense organs. So there is a temporary storage place in your sense organs like eyes, ears, tongue, skin, whatnot. If you have six senses, then we probably have the sixth sense organ, the sixth sensory memory. Anyways, that was a joke, by the way. So sensory memory is one stage of memory storage system where the information is held temporarily. The completely other end of the spectrum is the long-term memory where the information is held for a long period of time. So, okay, so we were talking about basics of cognitive psychology, and we said that cognitive psychology study cognition and memory. And we define cognition as a set of complex mental processes such as sensation, attention, perception, and memory. Then we define memory as mental process in the storage system. Do you see any redundancy here? We define cognition as a set of mental processes such as sensory, sensation, perception, attention, and memory. Then we are again talking about memory. Why do you think why do you think there's a need to refer to or list memory twice, both as a part of cognition and by itself? Think about it. Cognition is a mental process. You can pause the video here and think about it and come back. Well, the idea is this. Cognition is a mental process, and memory is included here as a mental process. And the other memory, or the second instance of the memory here, refers to memory as a storage system. Okay, now we'll go back to the actual puzzle, and we'll talk more about these puzzle pieces. Okay, so we are interested in comprehension of only written text, but what we discuss in this class would be equally applicable to other forms of language usage. And we'll talk more about it when we talk about language. So we define cognition as a set of mental processes, right? Well, for us to solve this puzzle, we need to understand the puzzle pieces. And the puzzle pieces are nothing but the same mental processes that we listed before as part of cognition, and they are sensation, attention, perception, and memory. So, in each of these units, we'll talk about these individual pieces: sensation, attention, perception, and memory. And when we say memory, we're specifically referring to long term. But there are other pieces that we need to talk about. Maybe I'll come back to this later. But we will look at these pieces first: sensation, attention, perception, and memory. And then we'll talk about the individual pieces, the fundamental pieces. That would be the end of the big picture. Now, let's talk about the first piece here. Again, we are just trying to get some basic sense of it. Remember, this is a big picture video, and we're only talking about basics of almost most of the stuff. But eventually, when we dig in deeper, having a basic knowledge would help you think deeper. And that's why we're having this big picture unit. Okay, so what is sensation? Now, just imagine if you close your eyes and try to read the sentence that is on the screen. What? Yeah. Can you read by closing your eyes? No, the information did not, or it doesn't enter. If it doesn't enter the system, basically your brain eventually, you won't be able to process information at all. So for us to comprehend or solve the puzzle of how we comprehend, we need to first look at the basic level of sensation, which is merely a mental process of capturing external information. And this is captured by our sense organs. So, for instance, when you are reading, your eyes are the sense organs that capture the printed letters. In your eyes specifically, in the later units, we'll talk about the structure of the eye and where the information is captured. But in your sense organs, including your eyes, there are some special neurons. These special neurons are called sensory receptors. So your eyes have sensory receptors, your ears have sensory receptors, all your sense organs have some special sensory receptors that are sensitive to a specific kind of stimulus or external raw energy. For instance, eyes are sensitive to light, your photoreceptors in your eyes are sensitive to light, and the receptors in your ears are sensitive to sound waves, and so on and so forth. And these are two important senses for us, but mostly we concentrate on the visual sensation because that's how you take the information in, especially when you are reading. So what is sensation then? Well, it's a mental process of capturing external information by your sense organs, in your sense organs, by your sense organs, especially in a structure called sensory registers. And these are stored in your eyes or your sense organs for a brief period of time. Again, keep in mind, sensation doesn't involve your brain. Sensation doesn't involve your conscious experience of it. Once it goes to the conscious experience, that's a part of perception. Sensation is merely capture of information. Now, we say that sensation is merely capture of information, and different sense organs capture different kinds of information. And once information is captured by your sense organs, right, then the brain will interpret this captured information. Brain will interpret this. This process of interpreting the captured information is called perception. So perception then is a mental process of interpreting the captured information that is captured in your sense organs. Now, when we say interpreting, what exactly do we mean here? Well, what we mean when we say interpreting is basically identifying what it is. So if it is a set of letters, then you're identifying that as letters. or a combination of letters as words is a mere identification, nothing more than that. This is the process perception that involves brain. Sensation, on the other hand, is a mere capture of information by your sense organs. So keep in mind, these are two different things. Sensation is mere capture, perception is identifying what is captured, and that involves brain. And is equally true for any of the senses, but we are mostly interested in the sight because typically we read using our eyes. Of course, there are other ways of reading, but we are specifically talking about visual, which also involves the auditory, because when you read something, your eyes will capture and your mind will automatically process the auditory information related to those. Now, here's another thing. Your eyes or your sense organs capture a lot of information. In fact, you'll learn later that your eyes capture 76% of information out there in the visual field. Now, let's do this small experiment. Just look straight ahead and keep your hand in front of your nose, right? Now, whatever kind of you can see when you move your hand to the left and to the right, whatever you kind of you can see, that's your visual field. And your eyes have these photoreceptors and the distribution of it in such a way that for every point in your visual field, there is a point on your retina that captures a light. In other words, most of the information out there in the environment is captured by your eyes. Now, once the information is captured, it's the work of the brain now to actually make sense of what it is. But the brain is incapable of making sense of all this information. So it's impossible for the brain from moment to moment basis to process the entire information. So what needs to happen is that your brain needs to select a portion of this vast amount of information that is captured by your sense organs. And so what it means is that perception is making sense of what it sensed, making meaning, interpreting, identifying the sense information, but it won't identify all the information, but it only identifies a portion of the information. Okay, wait a second. What does it mean? Well, the sense organs are capturing a lot of information, but your brain is only interpreting a part of it. So there should be something in between. Who is doing that part? What is that part of going from a large amount of information to a manageable amount of information? Somebody is doing this. Something is happening there. Can you think of what that process could be between sensation and perception that will help you go from being processing a lot of information to manageable information? Think about it. You can pause and think. Yes, you're right. It's attention. That's why we said SAPM, sensation, attention, perception in that order. So attention will help you zoom in to a portion of the sense information so it's manageable. And we'll talk about attention in the next slide. Now, coming to attention, all right, we said that it's between sensation and perception. Sensation happens at the level of your sense organs and perception at the level of the brain. And there is something in between, which is attention, which will help you go from large amount of information to narrowing it down to a manageable amount of information. So what is attention then? Well, attention is this process of focusing. It's a process of concentrating your resources on this entire sense information. So it's concentrating your effort to focus on a part of the entire sense information. That is attention. Now, when you're concentrating your effort to a part of the sense information, also keep in mind that you're spending effort. So think of attention as the process of using the energy, but also the energy itself. So that's why attention has two meanings. It's the process of concentrating your effort, but it's also the effort itself as a resource, which is limited. The typical analogy, one simple analogy I gave is to think of a credit card, right? Now, if I give you a credit card and say, okay, you can buy anything you want by using this credit card, what would you buy? But if you think of using the credit card to buy something as attention, as a process, right? What you can buy, though, depends on how much money there is in the credit card. So for you to use the credit card, you need to have money in the credit card. So the money is the resource part, and the process of using that money is the mental process part. So attention has two aspects to it. It's the process of using resources and the actual resource itself. Well, we're talking about the puzzle pieces. We talked about sensation, attention, perception. Well, we need to talk about the last part, although we kind of talked about this, which is the memory. right? So memory is both the storage system and the process of encoding, storing, and retrieving information. Now, as a storage system, we said previously that there are different stages or different places where the information is held in a physical system. One is at the level of sense organs, the other one is at the level of brain. At the level of sense organs, you call that sensory memory. At the level of brain, it's called long-term memory. So the information that is held in your sensory memory and the information held in your long-term memory are slightly different. Think about it for a second. You're looking at this picture, your eyes capture the image of this, that's a sensory memory. But once it is attended to and perceived, that perceived information is sent to your long term memory. Now, the question is, what is the difference between this memory and this memory? Or the information stored in this memory, information stored in this memory? I want you to pause here for a second and really think about the differences between these two memories and how the information that is held in your sense organs and your long-term memory could be different. And we'll continue discussing the same thing in the next slide. Well, I hope you gave a thought and you can kind of think about if this is sensory and long-term memory, the information that's in your sensory memory, which is basically an image captured of the information that's out there in the environment, is pre-perceived. Remember, sensation is before perception. So the information that's in your eyes, in your sense organs, is pre-perceived. In other words, it is before interpretation, raw, fine. But once the perception, interpretation happens, right, that's a part of your long-term memory. In other words, the information that's stored in your long-term memory is post-perceived. Post is after perception. The information in your sense organs is pre-perceived. So if it's pre-perceived, so it's raw. It's post-perceived, so it's refined. The other difference is that the sensory memory is at the level of sense organs, whereas long-term memory is at the level of the brain or mind. There is another difference here. Sensory memory information is held only for a fraction of a second to a max of a second or a couple of seconds. If you talk about the visual sensation, the information is held in your eyes for not more than 250 milliseconds. Yeah, one fourth of a second. But what about the information in your long term memory? But theoretically, at least, it's forever. That's why it's a long term memory. It is held for a long period of time. Now, we said that first information goes to the sensory memory, right? And it gets attended to and perceived. Then the perceived information is stored in long term memory, hopefully. Now, the question is, where does this process occur? Where does this transformation of raw information into refined information, which basically is meaningless to meaningful information, where does it happen? Well, you're right, it happens in short term memory, also called working memory. But you learn in this class that it's also called SAS. But I'm not going to scare you by actually giving the full acronym of that. But it's called SAS. It's one and the same. So information gets perceived where? In short-term memory slash work. Now, here is another thing I want you to think about. So we said that in the SAPM, where there's memory, right? And the memory means two things, a storage system and the mental process. As a storage system, it is at different levels. Like in the sense organ, it's a sensory memory. In the brain, it could be the working or slash short-term memory where the information gets perceived. Then if it's learned, it is stored in the long-term memory. But we also said that memory is also a mental process. Keep in mind that memory as a mental process refers to encoding, holding or retaining, and retrieving information. And that can happen anywhere. Encoding and retaining and retrieving information at the level of sensory organ is also memory as a mental process. Encoding, retaining, and retrieving information can also happen at the level of short-term memory. It equally is applicable at the level of long-term memory. So when we say mental memory as a mental process, referring to ERR, encoding, retaining, and retrieving information, it can refer to any of these storage systems. Well, we'll end this topic by talking about one specific classification. Again, we'll talk more about it later, but I just want to give you some basic information so you hold on to this information and then reuse it later. Is that the long-term memory, right, can be categorized. And there's one specific popular classification. According to that, it's Squire's classification. You can broadly define the information that's stored in your long-term memory of two different kinds. One is declarative memory, and the other one is non-declarative memory. Declarative memory refers to the memory that is declarable, basically. In other words, it's easy to talk about such things. For example, if I ask you, who is the first president of the United States? Well, you can tell me who it is. That's a part of your declarative memory. In other words, you can talk about it. If I ask you, what did you have for your breakfast this morning? What? You didn't have anything? Well, you better have something. Breakfast is the best, most important lunch, most important meal of the day. Anyways, so these two things you can talk about, right? That's a declarative memory. But there are some things that are difficult to talk about. It's not impossible, but difficult to talk about. And those would be under non-declarative memory. For instance, if I ask you, if you if you drove from say college to elsewhere or elsewhere to college or from one point to another, let's say it takes 10 minutes. Can you give me a moment to moment account of the entire 10 minutes as to how exactly you drove, starting from how you held it, when you press the accelerator and brake and everything. It's not that it's impossible, it's that procedures like habits, skills, these are difficult to put in words because we use this knowledge without our conscious effort and use it. Like if I ask you to write down my name. By the way, what's my name? Yeah, you're right. Can you spell it? Oh, well, I don't expect you to. But if you do, let's say DANDOTKAR, now when you're writing that, DAN, are you spending a lot of time trying to be consciously aware of D? Okay, I'm going to write D like this. You don't. It automatically happens. And if I ask you, how did you write D? You probably won't be able to describe the exact process, maybe. So that's the main difference between declarative memory and non-declarative memory. Another way to think about it, which is the easiest way, but I usually keep the easiest way to the end, is this is the what and this is the how. Declarative memory is like what a memory. Non-declarative memory is memory for how. Is also called procedural memory. Now, the declarative memory itself is of two different kinds, according to one of the classifications. One is episodic memory, the other one is semantic memory, which is a want, but the kind of information is slightly different. Episodic memory is personal. What did you have for breakfast again? Well, only right, it's personal to you. So this memory for personal experiences is episodic memory. And if I ask you who is the first president of the United States, there's general knowledge. So these two kinds of memories. You can talk about both these things. This is the what memory, but one is specific to your personal experience, while the other is general. So this is called episodic memory, this is called semantic memory, and this is the non-declarative or procedural memory. Again, we'll come back to this later in the last chapters, but I just want to give you a bigger picture. Okay, so this is the end of this topic. We started with the big picture, and we said that the puzzle you cognitive Sherlocks are asked to solve in this class is how we comprehend a written text. And we said that there are individual pieces that you need to understand first. And those pieces are sensation, attention, perception, and memory. But there are also other fundamental pieces. So before we actually talk about these other pieces, the main pieces, sensation, attention, perception, memory, first we'll talk about these fundamental pieces. And I've categorized these fundamental um, pieces into four different categories. The first thing we'll talk about is language and processes involved in language. The second thing we'll talk about is the theories of comprehension. Um, then we'll talk about the history of the puzzle or the history of. After we're done with this, then that's when we'll go to sensation, perception, attention, and the final thing is long-term memory. Now, keep in mind that this is counterintuitive, right? We're not starting from chapter one, where usually it is the history. We're starting with this is chapter 9, and there's a reason for that. Because the final goal for this particular class is to write a paper that to solve and if you talk about these two things early on, and when you participate in the discussions, it will help you reinforce your ideas and kind of give you more opportunities to make those connections that you will need to write a good paper. So that's why this will be chapter 9. Part of it, not the entire chapter, part of chapter 10. Then we go to chapter 1 and 2. Then we come back to chapter 3 and so on and so forth. Again, each week I'll have some overview video that will give you a better understanding, and I'll come back to this particular handout over and over again. Okay, so We'll talk more about language and the processing involved in language in the next video. But here's the question to think about. Why do we even need to talk about language? We are interested in comprehension of written text, and it's a cognitive psychology class. What is language? What does language have to do with comprehending written text? We'll keep thinking. We'll continue this discussion in the next video, language and processing. Thank you.